I am a white non-binary person with like longer growing brown hair with silver streaks, a large green framed glasses, and I'm wearing a gray jumper today, and the background is a minty green. I'm also fat. So I do research, as I have been introduced also, kind of like on equity in technology design. And I specifically do that through a lens of critical access studies, where I draw on queer and crip theories, because I kind of like see access as a larger frame of like how we can engage with technologies. I'm particularly interested in the perspectives of non-binary or overall minority gendered and or disabled people. And today I'm going to be talking a bit about which bodies are included in HCI research and which are not. And to no huge surprise, I'm spoiling the entire thing. You'll find out this is all very normative, but you're in for a little bit of a ride. As soon as I get this to work. Oh no, I forgot to turn this off. Anyway, before I start the talk proper, I should mention that there are images on the slides. I tried to. I also have a menagerie here that is not getting. Yeah, I don't get them out of the room right now. Anyway, so I do have images on my slides. I will also explain them, though most of them are kind of like abstract renditions of the things I talk about. They're mostly there for people to have a visual to hold on to if they want that and want to like look at something, but they do not necessarily convey a specific meaning that I could explain verbally in other ways than I already do. So let's get to it. Within the last few years, embodied computing and embodied interaction has garnered increasing interest from researchers and designers. And one of the sentences that is kind of like used a lot here is technologies are moving on even into the body. I have been using that sentence myself. And yeah, it just explains what happens a bit. But it kind of relates to what Leon Loke and Thekla Shiphorst, I probably mispronounced something there, have been coined the somatic turn in human-computer interaction, a turn towards the body and embodiment as such. And one that acknowledges that we all have bodies, and you all do too. I forgot to say the thing. So if you have any kind of needs, you need to fidget, or you need to walk out of the room for a minute, or you just like, need to walk around, or I don't know, stretch or whatever, please don't feel that social convention for my benefit have to keep you from doing that. I want you to feel comfortable in your bodies in the ways that are available to you, and social expectations as to how to behave with someone who speaks right now should not, in my case, keep you from doing things that make you feel comfortable. I think it's lunchtime with y'all, and like that's also very encouraged. Just in general. All right. So, and the somatic turn also acknowledges that we all have bodies and that our thinking, feeling, and engaging with technologies is fundamentally embodied. Like essentially everything we do is embodied because we do it in a body, but like that seems a bit basic, so I say it in a bit more fancy words. Anyway, in Loke and Shiphorst's article of 2018, they state that somatics practices explicitly frame an ethical relationship between care of self and our capacity to care for and act in the world. Somatics proposes an ameliorative practice of self-cultivation that aligns with the social tenets of research through design in HCI, which seeks to transform the world from its current state to a preferred state. The role and responsibility of the designer in creating technologies and interfaces that can take account of the somatic dimensions with its ethic of care is yet to be fully realized. So essentially, we're kind of like looking at like we want kind of like a different world. We want to center a little bit more on the body in that, and there are implications within that. And it sounds great, and I'm all for it. I just have a few questions. And one of them is like, what are those bodies in the focus and embodied interaction, and who do we account for when we talk about the body? And in embracing the somatic turn, we research and design personal artifacts that are in bodies, but for who? And so in that context, it is extremely interesting to me that this is the imagery that accompanies the article. And this is not a call out, very much not. It's more like, I want us to collectively reflect on where the field stands with that. But and it's also an article in Interactions, and so I should say, I want to acknowledge this might not have been the author's choice or even preference, but it's kind of like relevant that this is the imagery we choose to kind of like think about bodies. This is a very muscular body. Despite the black color used, it is a prototypically white body, and it also follows kind of cis male ideas and imaginings of embodiment. It's also fairly slim within a normative standard. The illustration focuses on the nerves, though I don't really got to what the numbers mean. They're kind of like numbers that point to things. I guess that specific nerve names, I have no idea what those are. And I did not look it up in my anatomy book. But it does a good job of explaining that, yes, also our nerves and senses and brain and processing and feelings are embodied. But it also subtly communicates something else. Like, there are specific norms governing what we expect in terms of embodiment and which bodies we think of when we do not specify further what we mean. So this is not necessarily a problem as such, but without reflection, I kind of like come to the conclusion that we end up designing for only certain types of embodiments. And that is kind of what happened in the last few years. And I'm going to show you some examples, because I did this like entirely critical analysis, and I did a few essays and theory-driven kind of probings, and particularly in the context of games and play as well. And so I want to talk a bit about that work. One of them is a literature analysis that had started with a whole lot of papers that largely from the DEI conference, the tangible, embodied, tangible, embedded, and embodied interaction. And they kind of like show, because that is the conference where HCI largely talks about embodied interaction. That was kind of the corpus that I looked at. And I used feminist content analysis to look at this. And I just mentioned this specifically as a method because I have used other methods to conduct literature reviews, but this one is particularly useful to uncover subtle biases and implicit norms. And this is the methodology section, because I like talking about this kind of stuff. So when we create knowledges about the ways that we do things, we also need to kind of like talk about the epistemological and methodological implications of research in these critical investigations. So because this is not neutral, the principles and aims guiding our research are highly relevant in shaping the outcomes. So next to a feminist content analysis that I conducted as my method, I also used feminist critical discourse analysis as my methodological framing. And that comes with several principles. And here's how I put them in practice. And it's just an example for you to kind of like understand where I come with this, because I do not claim to be neutral, and I kind of want to acknowledge that in my epistemological and methodological background as well. So one of the principles is to acknowledge materiality. And so I really aimed at explicitly looking at the material consequences of what it means to be discussed or not discussed, or kind of like how things are discussed within the source material. Another principle is to aim at transformation. And so I did engage in feminist political imagination, and you will also see that later when I talk about kind of like crypt cultures and how that kind of connects with alternatives. Research as analytical activism. So I tried to attend to my personal implication and standpoints. I am a non-binary person. I am also disabled, but I have like specific disabilities, some and not others. And I work sometimes with people who share some of the embodiment aspects, and sometimes they do not. And I'm a white person, which also comes with its specific kind of like movements through knowledge production and also society writ large, especially within Europe. And then Another principle of marginalization is an ideological structure and practice. So I kind of like try to understand body, mind, work, and design as influenced by powerful social constructs and continuous negotiations. This is the most boring slide, but it's also one of my favorite ones. Then the last two, complex concepts of power. So I kind of like tried to understand what the concept of the body was in the source material and how that related to specific power concepts within HCI, and then critical reflexivity, also acknowledging the limitations of scope and positionality that is inherent in my work. That comes to some extent from my lived experience, but it also comes from kind of like this, I have this drive, so what I'm not doing is kind of like a dispassionate, objective assessment of all of this. It's kind of like a critically informed assessment. That just like as a larger thing. By the way, this often includes my own work that I am like looking at it a few years later. I'm like, oh my God, who even let me publish this? Like none of this is meant as as like a kind of like bashing of others. I understand critique as a really crucial instrument of trying to figure out where a field can go further in whatever shape or form. To me, it's like an essential part of knowledge construction, really. So yeah, let's go to the juicy bits of that analysis, the results, because that is usually what is interesting to people. And all in all, I identified 4 types of contributions within the papers that I looked at: material investigations, design explorations, technological artifacts, and theoretical analyses. In most of the papers presented technologies, followed by design, theory, and material. And material was also kind of like the newest. It's kind of like one of the most fresh types of contributions, which is also why later I'm going to talk about that a bit more. And it had like the smallest amount of papers in the corpus. But these papers tend to only illustrate and concern themselves with body parts, which was interesting to me in terms of imagery. And yet there is a generalization happening to the body as an abstract ideal. And through the abstract, so the abstract becomes very concrete very fast. In one paper, bodies are themselves becoming material, specifically their hair. Though the authors only refer to white people's hair as human hair, which ignores the racist and oppressive politics around Black hair and renders Black people's hair essentially as less than human. And it would be easy to say, yeah, Katta, but this was only one paper, but it's kind of not. And you'll see more of that a bit later. But I noticed how visible bodies or body parts in really all of the papers are light-skinned or white and appear youthful. There was one where I wasn't sure. One paper where I wasn't sure. And then I kind of like want to ask the question whether the bodies we attend to in body interaction really should only be white or light-skinned. And there are alternatives around this. You could reflect on the oppressive politics that especially Black women are exposed to, and this is thankfully drawn by Dr. Michaela Lewis in collaboration here, to kind of understand what it means to like talk about human hair and not just white hair. There's this because the language also hides what is actually done here, right? It was only sleek hairstyles, and only blonde people, honestly, in the paper. And I mean, beyond this being an equity-related issue, I think also Black hairstyles in this specific case might productively challenge the initial design and help us to, like, you know, better designs, or at least reflect on the limitations of what we have proposed. And here, I really like this because this part is really just like, you know, you can look at other hairstyles. Here's a range of them, just in case you didn't know, because like most of us in research are all, or like the dominant characters in research are also white. And there is some exceptions were, by the way, when it was not white, there were some contributions from authors from Asian institutions. I do want to acknowledge that. Though they were kind of like presents an interface for embodied level design of augmented reality play. which systematically, on a systems level, as well as an instance of systemic thinking in the field, implements a notion of the ideal body as the body of the designers. And we find that a lot. But also in another instance where people worked with others in a participatory setting, it was very peculiar to me that the authors worked with specifically one participant in developing a situated approach to posture correction, but they never addressed the issue of that participant also being white. And it's a pictorial, if I recall it correctly, and through the entire thing, you can kind of see how, starting with creating kind of like these black colored markers on white skin as a starting process, guided their entire design process down to the final design, but that was not reflected. And you can do that. I'm not even saying that this is like that they're horrible people or that this is entirely wrong. I'm just saying we kind of like, I don't necessarily have a practice of kind of looking at these things and kind of the larger ramifications beyond a single paper within a field. And then similar to all of that, designerly assumptions tend to default to implicit norms largely by what remains unaddressed. For example, by focusing on the joy and the positive experience we aim for in our designs, we kind of conveniently ignore conversations we need to have about trauma and class. For example, in delineating the potential of embodied computing for playful eating experiences, the authors of another paper presume that eating and food is inherently related to joy. And this is one of my pet peeves, really. But it implicitly disregards the high and increasing prevalence of eating disorders, as well as the problems faced by people in poverty regarding food security. And so even temporally constrained limitations on food comprise positively connotated experiences only for those who did not have to face these limitations outside of their own volition. And then we really have to ask kind of like how embodied interaction design does not just become something that is relegated only for middle and upper class experiences. I also like to, in this context, show this like extremely uncomfortable wearable soft robotics support. I do not have a non-flat chest, but this is like just a drawing that is taken from the taken by drawing on the photograph in the paper, but it just highlights to me kind of like how uncomfortable this had to be. And it's so interesting because the authors kind of like from their names, and that is an insufficient criterion on like acknowledging gender, but it appeared to me that they at least had an indicate were not male. They had like typically female names, which makes this interesting because the norms are governing our interactions, not just if we kind of like are exemplars of that norm, but also we kind of default to it, even if it's like different from our own embodiments, which to me is an interesting observation to have, because it tells us how strong these norms are in governing our kind of like thinking and designing. All right. So the technological contributions that were made span from kind of like variables to play scenarios, music and art, as well as artifact for reflection. Though in that, authors did rarely specify the required skills relevant to engage with a specific technology. And if disability played a role at all, it was kind of like as another, or to introduce novelty or be like an isolated special case. And that means that disabled bodies are then further embedded in medical contexts, and embodied computing technologies aim to fix or correct them. And considering the many contributions oriented on allowing people to explore their creativity and appreciate their bodily feats, or just feeling comfortable in their own bodies, not considering disabled people in this context makes me wonder why we don't get to be comfortable in our own bodies, or like experience even within, there's things like chronic pain, and like you don't always have to have a positive relationship with your body either. But just trying to kind of like have things that allow us not to like aim at a different kind of embodiment and tell us that it's wrong, but rather allow us to accept and negotiate the present. But on another hand, and this is where other work comes in that Katta and Gilligan and I conducted together, we can see that even in immersive research, trying to transpose kind of like that bodily experience, we lack the knowledge in how to include people from the start and end up creating exclusive experiences that make a whole lot of assumptions about the bodies, engaging with them. Last year, I had the privilege of engaging with a lot of deaf people, and they were playing VR games. It was very interesting how the technology just kind of assumes that you rely on hearing to communicate with the physical environment you're in. So what deaf people did a lot was this. I think it's a killer for immersion. So there are probably different approaches. I don't know them yet, but we're going to look into that. But it's just very interesting to me to see how sometimes there are just like these subtle kind of like expectations that are not reflected on them, and then come into very popular technologies as well. And the expectation is that VR technology that it has in terms of bodily involvement is really extensive. And it cannot just create accessibility barriers for people who lend their body differently to the system, but it also kind of like, makes it difficult to just have any kind of different embodiment. And it usually doesn't, like, it usually is then only aware to the people who have kind of like this non-normative embodiment, because they're the ones who realize that this is like a different experience. And it's not necessarily for like, as long as you're within the norm expectation, it kind of like works, right? Or like if you can shape around them. But let's return a bit to like how bodies are conceptualized more generally. And I'm not going to go too deeply into the theories, and I mean, it might be understandable that in theoretical explorations around bodies, those are kind of like talked about in an abstract without attention to details and differences. However, that is a choice. European and North American white men dominate the reference space here, particularly regarding phenomenology, which is fine, but alternatives exist. And also in other regards, theoretical explorations tend to be inherently oriented on assumed and implicit norms and have kind of like this generalizability approach to it, like try to understand not the diversity of different bodies, but rather we are kind of like have this kind of essentialist approach to what a body does. For example, if walking is established as a mode of supporting creativity, as suggested in one of those papers, this has damning implications for people moving by using wheelchairs, crutches, scooters, or any kind of like other aids. The only time disabled people and their minority body minds are referred to, they serve as a thought experiment for non-disabled people. And so our lived experiences are only relevant to support theories that center our differences as deviating from the abstracted norm again. And then in really a similar vein, children, elderly, trans people, fat people, Black people are all loudly made absent as well. And as their lived experiences, as their lived bodies kind of compromise special cases for theoretical explorations, but never the base. And I feel looking at global makeup of humanity, should we really think about bodies and embodied interaction based on theories that generalize from really just a tiny privileged minority of embodiments? And so honestly, we really do have lots of other embodiment theories to draw on. And I'm going to acknowledge that all of the ones that I'm going to mention now are also created within a UK, Canadian, or US context. But Elizabeth Barnes' minority body theory, to Susan Fendel's feminist explorations of disabled embodiments, and Eli Clare's considerations on what it means to be queer and crippen embodiment, and what it means to think from embodiment instead of an artificial split between the body and the mind, or how Dejan Harrison's delineation of how anti-fat biases are deeply entrenched in racist practices and shape the embodied experience of both Black and fat people, and especially Black fat people. And And there are just like so many things that we could also look at. And those 4 are just a tiny selection of very specified embodiment theories and investigations that yet have to find a way of entering HCI. Though I gotta say, Katrin and I have used the minority body theory previously as an analytical lens, but there's just like so much more to do. And I mean, if we talk about the bodies that are included, one thing that I found quite curious is that there's this notion of talking about bodies in the singular, as in like most publications kind of like talk about the body, and so much that I had to edit my own writing on this several times to not fall into the same writing pattern because it's very persuasive. And it seems deeply ingrained and required intensive unlearning for even myself. However, speaking on the body in the singular, and I quote here, I quote Di Paolo Cuffari and De Jager's Linguistic Bodies. Speaking on the body in the singular hides the intricate complexity and diversity of bodies under a false universality, the and singleness, body. Thus, the image the phrase invokes is that of an abstract, adult, healthy, isolated, nondescript, typically male, typically white body. If we speak of bodies instead, we immediately connote relations and plurality, at least leaving the door open to think them. So honestly, I just want you all to use plurals in the future. But that is like the easiest step. But hence, I kind of like urge HCI researchers orienting themselves on the somatic turn and beyond to start talking about bodies as a plural, as a first step towards accounting for the plurality of body minds and the diversity of experiences. And embracing such an accountability does require us to also attend to the material consequences of our research and design works. And if the majority of papers on embodied computing exclude such marginalized experiences and others, we need to collectively reflect on how our work might contribute to these material effects. And I have recently started looking into the aesthetic and material qualities of technologies created largely for instead of with disabled people. Because if we take a closer look, we kind of see a specific tendency, particularly around disability, of how bodies are treated when they're present as non-normative. And this is often in clear opposition, at least for me, towards how disabled people embody their cultural practices and how they share their experiences among each other. And so I'm going to present to you 4 cases that kind of like are in opposition of what technology design does versus how the culture works. So for example, in the context of ADHD, we find this lovely wearable made from, that was a bit ironic, I'm sorry. We find this wearable made from strong textiles and vibrating motors. It binds the body of the child with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and warns them before they might impulsively act in their environment. This is also called blurting. So it's kind of like trying to be like, oh, you're being impulsive, so maybe you don't want to act on this impulse. By the way, this tendency to restrict ADHD bodies can be found in many technologies in this space, and we published on that as well recently last year. Still, so what this does is kind of like it restricts the body, but it doesn't even give it like an outlet or like an alternative way of engaging with the world. And my opposition to that is kind of like trying to understand that you know this impulse or kind of like the need for bodily movement comes from somewhere. So here we see a child presumably inattentively playing with a pencil by balancing it on their face and fidgeting with their hands. But those are strategies of self-regulation, and they usually are really, and I talk from experience, they help regulate attention within a more self-determined and honestly a more relaxed fashion. So when I'm not talking, but rather attending talks, I usually knit or stitch something or like, you know, draw, because like if I would only look at the person's face and kind of like their stuff, my mind will go everywhere but not listening. And so this removes pressure from an external environment. It is caused by remembering not to blur it and allowing attention to flow more freely. It's not even that you know, like the blurring usually comes from trying to suppress so much and not being, and then it bubbles over. And instead of having a dedicated piece of technology on their body, this child kind of like uses aspects of their body and their bodily movements as it is, and uses their environment to regulate their attention on their own terms. And it's just, I feel, a very different approach towards how technologies tend to act in that space. And in a similar space of neurodivergence, here we see kind of a difference between teaching normative social cues to autistic children, and in the next picture you will see self-guided inspiration of communication and presentation of affect. Because here as well, technology in the form of wearables operate on the body of the child, ultimately ignoring their sociality with the aim to override it, instead of creating spaces where they could figure out their individual style and preferences to engage with their environment. So what these Google Glass approaches, give me a second. Are envisioned for is that autistic people can kind of like, get cues into how to read the emotional expression of people they encounter with, by the way, an incredibly reduced set of emotions that are woefully under complex. But also kind of assuming that sometimes also there's a suggestion that then this could make suggestions on how to respond to that, and making it an entirely shallow conversation anyway, or interaction, because then, it follows a specific script instead of kind of a mutual exchange. And so this means to me that communication is not a mutual interaction, but something that is wholly dominated by the styles of the majority of interaction that is expected from neurotypical norms. And this is just an autistic kid sharing their play setup of lining up toys. And honestly, they effectively communicate their interests with their environment, and it doesn't always need to be verbalized. And it doesn't need to be like a specific way, but kind of like sharing a row of cars, or for example, can be social. It can mean like, inviting someone in to engage with something they like. It a lot of autistic sociality just kind of aims at sharing things and being excited together, but you often don't get to these places because people are so hell-bent on describing facial expressions along 8 sets of emotions that are really wholly reductive, instead of just looking at what you could have in that context. I'm getting punchy here, I'm a bit sorry. Anyway, changing the subject towards kind of like deaf contexts, and I have been recently exploring with some deaf friends as well. And I find it very, very stark, a stark image, because the hearing world, or the tech world here, inscribes itself quite literally through scars on the bodies of deaf people, and then providing them with substandard hearing equivalents while expecting people to perform on the same kind of like level of like hearing capabilities that are seen by deaf people. Oh, thank you, Jill. Jill said that the punchiness is great. It can be punchier. Maybe in the questions. Oh, so can the cat. So anyway, kind of like, provide people with substandard hearing experiences, inscribe them literally in their thing, and then expect them to perform at the same level of like hearing standards, when, deaf culture already comes with a whole set, 200 to 300, of sign languages and approaches to communicate across them that are linked to vibrant communities. So what it does here, the technologically facilitated engagement with the environment is created through magnetic metals and electric signals coated in hard plastic, expected to function, and then people are expected to function like a hearing person, and they dismiss that fragility of any kind of technological setup when there is, a huge, rich cultural setup that is like also different across different kind of like localities, and it's just coming with so much vibrant. I don't know. Also, this man is just beautiful. Oh, for those who don't know, this is Natalie Marco. he is the first ever contestant who won America's Next Top Model, and this tells you more about me than it really should. Anyway, and this is the last one of my kind of like visual explorations that I conduct. This is like work from this year, is ongoing. So please challenge me on that. I'm still exploring different use cases. I'm still looking at what that means. But this image here discusses, kind of like presents a cyborg as envisioned by an ableist environment that is propped up by a highly technical, refining, complicated setup. And wheelchair users are more interested in environmental structures attending to the specific modes of movement, which are sometimes even perceived as preferable. And that exoskeleton, by trying to shape people's bodies into movements that are akin to what is perceived to be the norm, which is walking, with belts, metal pieces, and hard plastic contraptions, works towards that goal and operates on that body and kind of like contorts it into specific movements that are expected. But the wheelchair, in contrast, kind of becomes a more symbiotic aspect, enabling new forms of mobility, which yet have to be accommodated more broadly. So what I find is hard materials, even if occasionally flexible in technological approaches. Hard plastic, restricting textiles, metal contraptions, and through those materials that embody ableist norms. And on the other hand, in disability cultures, we find an acceptance of non-normative embodiments, socialities, and communicative preferences. We find those are, by the way, always negotiated, but it's super fun. And what we also find is kind of like fluid engagements with environments, self-determined choice making, and fundamentally not individualized, but dialectic approaches to interactions, even in the use of technology, because, also disabled people like technology, just not that necessarily. But yeah, what can we do then to not design against bodies, but engaging with non-normative embodiments within the somatic turn? And I have for you a set of provocations, I call them, that I kind of feel can guide some of these reflections. One of them is that I suggest to update theories and that we expand the current set of theories informing our work, because the one we have is really boring. It's limited. I am convinced that drawing in complementary perspectives and thickening our theoretical background, that will just strengthen the contributions that our field can make more generally. And it can be more relevant, and it can be just like, more well-grounded if we acknowledge the diversity of embodiments also in our theoretical backgrounds. Further, forcing ourselves to be open to plurality has the potential to consciously train us to think beyond static and singular norms. And if from the start we think about bodies in multiplicity, we might account for differences in embodied experiences as well. Plurals all the way. I'm sorry for the movement there. I forgot to turn that off. Another step lies in checking out privileges. If the ideal body is the designer's body, as long as they are light-skinned, slim, and flat-chested, otherwise ignore that, we need to reflect on our own embodiments and how they play a role in creating technologies for embodied interactions. So kind of ask yourselves, where are the trans, the crypt, the fat, the queer, the black, the mad, the damaged, the sick, the old, the young, the dead, the sexual bodies in embodied computing? I totally forgot a few. And also, I have encountered that a lot, but like, don't be too hung up on what you intended, kind of like forget your good intentions. I know they're good, right? But like, honestly, disregard your intent and kind of listen to critique more appreciatively. Like, this is not towards you. I assume you are all fine people, but like, I've just encountered that so often that I need to say it. But critique is meant usually as something, as kind of like a mode of trust that allows you to reflect and do better, and someone's actually helping you, and focus kind of on the material effects of your work, or how that kind of what can come from that. And you can have the best of intentions and you can still do a lot of harm. And the problem is not that, something is not ideal or like or like, something is criticized by someone as like who completely had a different interpretation of your work, but how you respond to that critique is how you're gonna be judged usually. So that is an FYI. So even if we tried our best, perfect work kind of like is out there, no, that's not actually possible. So honestly, Haraway is really helpful here. Donna Haraway's limited positionality kind of approach, because there will be imperfections, because but only if we acknowledge that we have a problem, that our beings and our embodiments, and with that our work and our actions, are shaped by strong and dominant societal biases, we maybe start to be accountable to them and exploring how to do better. But also, you don't all have to do that in one paper. Like, this is a field thing. Like, the issue here is not every single individual paper. I have used them as examples, but they stand for kind of like, a larger set of kind of contributions and how they shape how they are shaping themselves. And only by kind of like acknowledging that there might be, there are some bodies missing, we kind of like can start thinking about what to do about that. Almost there. Another suggestion is to just name the norms that govern our work, because in searching for and naming the normative tendencies, expectations, and assumptions that do shape our designs, we kind of like can take the first step towards encountering them and creating more equity-related awareness, or just don't. You don't have to do that. But I want you to make a choice and not just like end up, repeating the things and the norms and upholding them without your intent. And within that imperfection, I finally suggest that we embrace the inherent mess of our living, sweating, stumbling, and swearing bodies. And embodied computing is full of politics, which are currently shaped more normatively and abstracting away from the inherent messiness of living. But what about we embrace that messiness? And we tried that very recently. And for those of you who are going to be at Chi, I can like invite you now to come to our Alt-Chi paper. Yeah, a bit cheap, but I'm going to do that. And we kind of tried and developed that concept of Cryptopias within HCI. And we invite others to similarly create pockets of freedom that acknowledge the diversity and messiness of different embodiments. Because the thing is that we also learned there, and this drawing is, by the way, by Kay Kender, one of the people in the Crypt Collective we have here. Like, one of the things that disabled communities can, or like that I have learned from being part of and like engaging with disabled communities, is that things are messy and things are contradictory, but we try and use that as a protective thing. So I return to the Paolo Cuafari and De Jager again. Linguistic Bodies is the book, and they state there are literally billions of different human bodies. We should beware of drawing general conclusions from their apparent universals. End quote. There are so many more opportunities we may take up, and there's so much more to do, and there are so many more bodies we might to attend to in embodied interaction. We just have to do it. So anyway, thank you for attending this talk, and like for those of you who stayed, because like for taking the time and kind of sit with the discomfort, because not everything is kind of like comfortable here. But I really like that we could take this step together to hold ourselves accountable for the work that we do, and with the unintended but nevertheless impactful ramifications that our work might have. And I'm looking forward to discussions on this. I think that was exactly on time.
Thank you, Katta. I'm unsure if you're hearing, but you just got a loud rounds of applause for this outstanding talk. So we're expecting an outstanding questions from audience, and we're gonna start with students asking questions, online, offline. Online attendees, I see 15 of you. If you have any question, drop a chat and I'm gonna read it for you. Questions? Then I can start with my selfish question with my interest. Thank you for the fantastic talk, and your talk reminds me of recent Twitter thread about this Kai paper that won Best Paper Award about haptic technology that guides people with visual impairment. And then there was a bit of small battle about their method. So my question is about actually how to approach method and practice of research. And the battle was about the authors of the paper used non-visually impaired people or mildly impaired people and then brought them into blind, dark room, kind of simulated blindness. And then there was a debate about whether that's right or wrong. But my question is not about that. My question is more about my sympathetic stance to the author in taking the approach that they might have difficulty recruiting people with visual impairments. And I think there's a norm in CHI that you have to hit a certain number of the participants to get that P below a certain number for statistical testing and so on, right? So what is your advice to the CHI community on this kind of issue in terms of methodological and practical challenge of getting participant, subjects, or member of the community engaged in the research when they're not easily accessible for the researchers?
Right. This is difficult because I'm just going to come with an impossible proposal, but it's not that impossible, but it requires just a lot of work, and we usually don't take the time to put it in there because, as you said, easily accessible. And maybe these populations are not easily accessible because while they're often excluded from research, they're also over-researched in terms of research that they do not guide themselves, and that comes from kind of like these different approaches to how to understand the body minds and all that. And so my collaborations with the deaf community took 2.5 years of learning sign language, plus building connections into the community, and then hiring deaf researchers. Like that kind of like prepared me to be able to collaborate with deaf researchers, and then hiring or like collaborating with deaf students and like ultimately hiring them. But also being able to kind of like just advise them in like a sufficient way, and then letting them guide the thing, and always have kind of like deaf perspective centered on that because I am hearing, right? But as I said, that took 3 years of kind of like community, or almost 3 years of kind of community building. And I'm even ashamed still of like things that I did half a year ago in parts, and I still have so much more to learn there. And people are very patient with me. But, you know, the question is, if there is no community kind of contact and kind of community engagement, why you would want to design for that community and what that kind of like says about work. Like, I'm not saying this is necessarily negative, but there is sometimes kind of an unchecked altruism in our work as well, where so for example, when I talked about there was this, when I did my PhD, there was this challenge, I think it was on Facebook, that where people were encouraged to describe the work that they do in the absolute worst terms possible. So what I said was, I'm using autistic kids to further my career, and they get like little out of it, which is really like in the worst terms. They got the artifacts, and I hope good experiences, and I can justify what we did there for myself. But to some extent, sometimes the credit comes more to the researcher and to the research community, and I do lately want to question why or what motivates people to kind of like create for communities that they don't have any contact with or kind of like context in, because if you do, then you also find ways around kind of like designing that. And way too often, especially disability, is kind of like framed as a problem, and it's a convenient problem because that is the dominant understanding of disability in kind of like, you know, within funding bodies and within society writ large. There's like, you know, a problem and you can fix it with technology and it's going to be so efficient and it's like going to be great. Though the problem is usually not on the body, it's usually within the interaction. So and there the notion of disability cultures comes in. So I haven't read the paper, I gotta say. I have seen some of the discourse, so to speak, around it, but like, or the discussions around it. And all that said, I also know it's an extreme privilege that I had like 3 years of funding and the funding body that kind of like allowed me to explore things that way, and to kind of like be like, well, I'm gonna see how that turns out, I guess. Which is, you know, a luxury within the kind of like systemic pressures of academia. So not a great answer, not a real fix to like your question, but just a bunch of thoughts that I rambled.
That's very insightful. Thank you. Next question. Oh, yeah, Isabel, go ahead.
Okay, hello. So I guess sort of one of the questions that was kind of interesting to me is sort of the last project in my PhD that I just finished was sort of this kind of a turn towards reflection a little bit in sort of design and sort of encouraging users to engage in critical reflection over their own habits of technology use and all of that sort of stuff. And just as somebody who is not really in sort of the embodied interaction sort of space, I'm just curious to what extent that's been something that's been really occurring in some of these designs that are happening here. Because I could imagine there could be some sort of fruitful sort of artifacts and sort of discussions going on where, like, you know, encouraging users to reflect on sort of the physical technologies they're using and how those embodiments are making them feel, and is this something that's actually improving their life in some meaningful way, you know, even within or, you know, within research context, but also even as sort of like long-standing tool. So like, I've been working in personal informatics and all of that sort of stuff going on there, but I imagine there it could be some interesting sort of stuff going on there. I'm just not quite certain about the area and what's happening really.
Oh, totally. I would even say like the starting point where is there, and what a faux pas. I didn't even mention Kia Hoek here. But like she and her group of people have done a lot in that regard as well. Especially there's kind of this concept of a somesthetic mat where you lie on and kind of like it's heated according to the Feldenkrais method, if I'm not completely mistaken. And you can kind of like experience your body in like different ways.